Why was everyone telling her to stay down when every instinct in her body told her to rise? The forest was quiet in that haunting way that only comes after chaos, when fear sits in the air like dust. Alina Reeves pressed her back against the rough bark of a pine tree, breath held, listening to distant voices over the radio that sounded steadier than the men speaking them felt. She could hear it in the silence between words, hesitation, confusion, a growing realization that something was deeply wrong. They didn't know where the shots were coming from. They didn't know how many there were. They didn't know how to fight back. And yet she did. Her hands were steady, but her heart was. It pounded not with panic, but with a familiar tension she hadn't felt in years, the quiet click of instincts waking up. She hadn't come into this deployment as a shooter. She came as the analyst, the quiet one in the back of the room, the one who saw patterns and briefed others on threats. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. She watched the ground, the trees, the angles of splintered bark and disturbed needles. Every mark was a clue. Every echo was a thread. While others froze, she was already mapping the battlefield in her mind: distance, elevation, timing, terrain. It was as if the forest had begun speaking and she remembered how to listen. The others shouted over the radio for air support. Orders were repeated, then repeated again, as if saying them with greater urgency would somehow turn them into safety. But she could hear another sound underneath it, the sound of men trying not to sound afraid. She thought of how many times she had been underestimated in briefing rooms, the quiet glances, the casual assumptions, the way people heard intelligence analysts and stopped listening for anything more. It used to bother her. Now, in this moment, it felt like an unexpected kind of freedom. No one expected her to act. No one expected her to lead. No one expected her to be the one who saw what was happening. Which meant no one would stop her. Why are they waiting? She thought, eyes tracking a faint movement on a distant ridge. Because they didn't see it. Because they weren't trained to look this way. Because they were terrified, and because she was. Not anymore. She took a slow breath. The world narrowed, the fear quieted, and in that stillness a decision settled into place, the kind that doesn't roar, doesn't shout, doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives undeniable. She would engage, but she would also carry the weight of it. Because she knew too well what happened when a shot was taken on the wrong information, and the memory of that single, painful mistake was still living somewhere deep inside her, where guilt and discipline shared the same space. And yet people were bleeding, people she could save. So she moved. Not bravely, not recklessly, but with the quiet determination of someone who finally accepted what she was, and what she could no longer pretend not to be. What did it feel like to step back into a life you thought you left behind? Alina shifted low through the underbrush, letting the forest swallow her movement as naturally as breath. The others called for her over the radio, their voices layered with confusion, frustration, even anger. But they didn't understand. To them, silence meant fear. To her, silence meant control. She remembered the years of training, the long days, the still, aching hours where the only thing that moved was the wind and her heartbeat. She remembered a gravel-voiced instructor who never praised lightly and never wasted words, a man who'd looked at her and seen something even she hadn't believed she possessed. "You don't just shoot well," he'd told her once, "you think well." But that memory came with another one, a face, a boy, a shot she should never have taken. She pushed it down, not to erase it, but to hold it carefully, respectfully, because it mattered. Because it always would. Her breathing slowed as she settled into position. The world telescoped. Sound thinned. Emotion softened into something sharper, something clearer. The wind shifted and she felt the way it moved through the trees rather than simply watching it. She wasn't chasing the target, she was listening for it. A fleeting shadow. A subtle movement. A shape that didn't belong. There. She didn't smile, she didn't tense, she didn't celebrate. She simply understood. And then she took the shot. The forest didn't erupt. It didn't echo with glory. It exhaled. Her hands didn't tremble, but inside, something stirred: relief and sorrow, discipline and regret, all sharing the same breath. Because every life taken, even in defense, carried its own echo. She shifted positions without hesitation, moving through instinct, memory, discipline. The battle became quieter after that. Not less dangerous, just more focused. She could sense the remaining shooters beginning to understand what they were facing. They weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted. And that realization carried its own kind of silence, one born of respect rather than fear. She didn't rush, she didn't chase glory, she waited, measured, chose. Not one of her movements felt triumphant. Each one felt necessary. Necessary and costly. And yet, with every decision, with every controlled breath, she felt another truth rising through the tension. She hadn't come back to prove anything. She'd come back because no one else could. How do you carry the burden of a past mistake when the present demands that you act? The final shooter didn't fall like the others. He adapted, learned, forced her closer than doctrine allowed. For a moment, fear brushed past her, not the fear of dying, but the fear of becoming that person again, the one whose shot had changed a life she could never give back. She hesitated just for a breath. And in that breath lived 3 years of doubt. What if she was wrong again? What if she misread the moment? What if another innocent face would follow her into sleep? But this time the difference was clear. The intelligence was right. The threat was undeniable. The lives behind her weren't shadowed maybes, they were real, human, bleeding, waiting. She could hear them over the radio, hear the pain, hear the urgency, hear the trust they didn't even realize they'd placed in her. The choice wasn't between shooting and not shooting. It was between acting and abandoning. And Alina Reeves had never been someone who abandoned others. So she ran, not out of recklessness, not out of rage, but out of responsibility. She felt the wind of the bullet that nearly reached her, felt the closeness of danger like a living presence brushing past her ear. And yet she kept moving, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd finally understood something important. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear decide for you. Her last round became heavier than any she'd ever chambered. It was not just a bullet, it was trust, consequence, promise. She steadied, remembered, accepted, and then she finished it. Silence followed, not victory, not celebration. Just silence. The kind that lets grief and relief sit beside each other without argument. She didn't raise her head in triumph. She didn't shout. She didn't feel larger than the moment. She felt small, human. And as she walked back toward the men who now looked at her differently, who now understood who she had been all along, she carried not the pride of survival, but the weight of responsibility. The mission had ended, but something else had begun. Why did the room fall quiet when she entered, and why did it feel heavier than the battlefield? Back at base, they wanted explanations, calculations, diagrams. They wanted to know how she'd done what they couldn't. Charts and maps filled the briefing room, but beneath all the technical questions, she could feel another question rising unspoken. Who are you really? She spoke plainly, calmly, without bravado. She described angles and wind shifts, patterns and terrain logic, patience and risk and judgment. But she left out something they would never fully measure. What it cost. Because some lessons couldn't be taught with numbers. Some could only be carried. When they handed her a new assignment, one that used both her mind and her discipline, she didn't feel powerful. She felt accountable. To the living, to the fallen, to the ones she could still protect. And slowly, something inside her, something she'd buried beneath guilt and doubt, began to steady. Not because the past stopped haunting her, but because for the first time since that terrible shot years ago, she felt like she had a way to make meaning out of it. What happens when your greatest skill becomes something you must teach others to wield wisely? Weeks became months. Missions shifted from chaos to precision. She learned to predict rather than react, to prevent rather than repair. Each engagement became shorter, quieter, less dramatic, and somehow more meaningful. Not every victory was loud. Some arrived as absence. Absence of casualties. Absence of fear. Absence of folded flags. She began to see soldiers not as assets, not as statistics, but as sons, daughters, friends, futures. She saw the people behind the uniforms, including the ones on the other side. The day she found the photograph of an enemy sniper smiling beside her mentor, the air felt different around her. That woman had trained, had learned, had believed. Just like Alina, war didn't erase humanity. It only complicated it. And for the first time, Alina understood that respect did not weaken resolve, it deepened it. Because compassion did not soften her aim. It strengthened her purpose. She no longer saw herself as someone defined by a single mistake. She was defined instead by what she chose to do after it. So what remains when the missions end, the victories, the failures, or the quiet choices made in between? Years later, as she stood in a room filled with younger operators looking to her not for instruction, but for guidance, Alina finally understood what her mentor had once meant. Legacy wasn't built from medals, or numbers, or the sound of applause in a crowded room. Legacy was built quietly, in the hands of those you prepare to carry the burden after you. In the lives saved because someone learned to decide carefully. In the restraint someone remembers when the moment feels rushed and uncertain. In the understanding that true strength isn't loud. It's patient. It's honest. It knows the cost. And yet it still stands when others cannot. She didn't tell her students how to be heroes. She taught them something harder. How to be human, in moments when it would be easier not to be. And as the years stretched forward, and as missions changed, and as futures unfolded in ways none of them could predict, one quiet truth followed her wherever she went. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the silence suddenly feel heavier than the gunfire that had echoed minutes before? The forest had gone quiet not peacefully, but cautiously, like it was holding its breath with her. Alina stayed low behind the rocks, feeling the cool grit against her palms, every sense sharpened. The smell of sap, the faint metallic tang of powder in the air, the distant sound of boots moving to treat wounded men, every detail wrapped around her like a second world layered on top of the visible one. But even as she watched, even as her body remained still, her mind wouldn't stop moving. The shot she'd taken, the one that started it, still lingered in her chest, not as triumph, not as relief, but as a reminder that doing the right thing rarely came without a cost. Somewhere inside, a quiet voice whispered the same question it always did after a trigger break. Was there any other way? She knew the answer. She had known it before she fired. She knew it now, but knowing never erased the echo. A movement of dust near a fallen log to her northeast drew her attention again. Not dramatic, not obvious. Deliberate. Calculated. Someone else was repositioning. She steadied her breathing. Not calmer, just more deliberate. Fear didn't disappear, it reshaped itself into awareness. Her eyes traced the slope, the jagged line of the ridge, the faint shimmer of heat lifting off stone. She didn't chase the shot. She waited, patient the way Callahan had drilled into her years earlier. The forest offered hints, not answers, and she'd learned to interpret hints better than most. A part of her wondered what Morrison was thinking now, pinned down, frustrated, unsure where the shots were coming from. She could almost feel his conflict through the radio silence. He believed in orders, believed in protocol, believed in waiting for the response designed by someone else. But waiting wasn't neutral. Waiting had consequences too. Another round cracked somewhere across the valley, not toward her this time, but toward the wounded being dragged into cover. She saw a man wince, his jaw tightening in silent pain, refusing to cry out because others were worse off than he was. That quiet act of endurance steadied her more than any training ever had. There are moments, she thought, when hesitation becomes its own kind of failure. She shifted again, careful, controlled, moving just enough to change her angle without revealing herself. Her elbows pressed into rough stone, the ground cold through her sleeves. The reticle drifted across rocks, branches, shadows, nothing that felt real yet. Then a subtle curve of fabric where no natural line should be. The world slowed. Her chest tightened. Not fear. Responsibility. She closed one eye, then reopened it, verified the angle, the wind, the reflected light, the ghostly outline that barely seemed to exist until she recognized it for what it was. Someone who believed they were invisible. Someone who believed they were safe. Someone who had no idea how close they were to being seen by a woman they had no clue existed in their world. She adjusted slightly, feeling the familiar pressure of the cracked rifle stock against her shoulder. The damage worried her not because of herself, but because one mistake, one mismanaged recoil, one slip of form and— No mistakes here. No assumptions. She slowed her breath again, counted the pause, measured the silence not in seconds but in heartbeats. I don't have to want this, she reminded herself quietly. I just have to be certain. The shot broke with a restrained violence, not loud, not theatrical, but absolute. Silence swallowed the echo almost immediately. For a brief moment, Alina didn't move. Not to celebrate, not to confirm, just to acknowledge that another life had ended because she chose to end it. And because if she hadn't, others would not survive. The conflict didn't weaken her resolve. It made it honest. She rolled carefully from the position before anyone could triangulate her, sliding behind another cluster of stone and brush. Tiny fragments of bark clung to her sleeve. Pine needles scratched against her wrist. Every movement was grounded in muscle memory, the body remembering a job it had once tried to forget. As she settled into the new angle, the forest felt different again. Quieter, more watchful. They weren't firing anymore. They were adapting. She recognized the shift at once, not tactical silence but strategic silence. The kind soldiers used when they realized the fight had changed and the rules they relied on no longer applied. Somewhere out there, she imagined one of them adjusting their grip, lowering their breathing, understanding that the predator they thought they were wasn't the only predator here. For a strange, fleeting moment, she felt something like respect. Not admiration. Not sympathy. Respect for skill. Respect for discipline. Respect for an enemy who understood the same language of patience, and now feared it being spoken fluently in return. Her radio crackled softly, Morrison's voice strained but steady. "Reeves, where are you?" She didn't answer. Not yet. Not until it was safe to speak without consequence. Words carried risk here. Noise carried risk. Explanation carried risk. Action in this moment was quieter. And truer. Another movement, this one lower, more cautious. A shadow slipped between two trees, then vanished again. Whoever remained was smarter, slower, patient in a way that told her they'd survived more than one engagement in their life. They were thinking. So was she. Her hands tightened around the rifle, not with aggression, but with a kind of bittersweet acceptance. 3 years ago, she had believed that leaving this work meant leaving the part of herself that had once been capable of this kind of clarity. She convinced herself that intelligence analysis was safer, cleaner, more humane. But there was nothing clean about what she did today. Nothing detached. Nothing distant. And yet, this time, her choices aligned with what mattered most. This time, she wasn't carrying uncertainty into the shot. This time, there was no blurred line between doubt and necessity. The hesitation inside her softened, not disappearing, never disappearing, but shifting into something steadier. Resolve tempered by conscience. Responsibility balanced by restraint. Not a soldier proving a skill, not a sniper chasing numbers, not a woman hopping to erase a mistake. Just someone who refused to let others die when she had the ability to prevent it. A faint click of metal echoed across the ridge, almost imperceptible, almost masked by distance, but Alina heard it. Preparation. Adjustment. A man readying himself to fire. She exhaled, not in dread, not in anger, but in understanding. This wasn't about outshooting someone. It was about ending something before it took more than it already had. Her cheek rested lightly against the stock as she brought the rifle back up. The world through the scope narrowed to light and shadow and breath and consequence. The last thing she felt before the shot wasn't adrenaline. It wasn't fear. It was a quiet, steady promise to herself. Let this one be right. And if it must leave another scar, let it at least save someone else from carrying theirs. She squeezed gently. The forest went still again. Even the wind seemed to stop. And for a brief, fragile moment, Alina Reeves let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. The grief, the relief, the unresolved ache that came from doing what was necessary, and knowing that some part of her would always wish necessity had never existed in the first place. But beneath all of it, there was something else. Not pride, not triumph, just a small, steady truth. She had acted when it mattered. And sometimes, that was the only difference between tragedy and survival. Why did the moment after the final shot feel heavier than the fight itself? The world didn't rush back all at once. It returned in fragments, a breath of wind moving through the branches, the distant murmur of wounded voices being tended to, the slow rustle of leaves settling where bullets had passed moments earlier. Alina stayed still, cheek still resting against the worn rifle stock, as if lifting her head too soon might invite the past to flood in and drown her. She waited, not because she doubted the outcome, but because certainty meant nothing until the forest agreed with it. Seconds stretched, thin and fragile. Then no return fire. No movement on the ridge. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't celebrate. The kind that acknowledged something irreversible had happened. She lowered the rifle gently, almost carefully, as though it were something fragile instead of something capable of changing lives in a breath. Her hands were steady. Her chest was. There was a tremor there, not visible, not dramatic, just a subtle weight settling deeper into her ribs. She didn't feel victorious. She felt accountable. Footsteps moved somewhere behind her, cautious, uneven. Morrison's voice finally cut through the radio again, softer now, no longer sharp with command, but edged with something closer to disbelief. "Reeves, talk to me." She closed her eyes for a second. Only a second. Then she pressed the radio to her lips. "Clear," she said quietly. Just one word. But it traveled farther than she intended. Silence answered, not confusion this time, not tension, just silence shaped by realization. She knew they were processing what clear meant, what it implied, what it revealed about the woman they'd assumed was only there to brief them. Someone shouted for medics. Someone else breathed a shaky thanks into the open air, not even realizing the transmission was still live. Alina didn't absorb the gratitude. She focused on the movement of her legs as she finally rose from the ground, each step careful, methodical, grounding her body before her mind could drift anywhere else. She slung the damaged rifle across her back. Not proudly, Not defiantly, just respectfully. The slope down the hill felt longer than when she climbed it. The rocks seemed sharper beneath her boots. For a moment, as she passed a cracked branch scarred by a stray round, she remembered another hillside, another afternoon, another mission where she had walked down after a shot that changed everything. Back then she'd felt hollow. Today she felt weighted. Different but not lighter. Near the casualty collection point, Morrison turned at the sound of her approach. His face was drawn, streaked with sweat and dirt, eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with realizing just how close they'd all been to losing much more than time. He looked at her the way people look at storm clouds after rain ends, with gratitude, with caution, with a quiet understanding that power doesn't always arrive loudly. "You did that," he said, almost under his breath. She didn't answer. Not because she was avoiding the words, but because there was nothing useful to add to them. A medic brushed past, guiding a wounded soldier onto a stretcher. The man caught her eye for a moment, just a flicker, and in that glance there was relief, confusion, and something else. Trust he hadn't consciously decided to give her. It felt fragile in her hands. Too fragile. Morrison swallowed, searching for something to say that sounded like leadership instead of apology. "You went against orders," he said, not accusing, not harsh, just acknowledging the truth. Elena nodded slightly. "I know." He waited for justification. She didn't offer any. Because explanations made the act smaller, tried to box it into something neat when it had never been neat. The reality was simpler than rationalization. People had been dying. She had been able to stop it. And choices had consequences, including hers. Morrison exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to reveal how tightly he'd been carrying it. "You kept us alive," he admitted. The words didn't land as praise. They landed as responsibility. Elena looked at the stretcher being lifted toward the helicopter. The blades hadn't even begun to spin yet, but the future was already shifting for everyone who would board it. Some would heal. Some would carry scars no one else could see. Some would wonder, for years, how the day might have ended if help had come a few seconds later. And she would wonder something different. She would wonder how many quiet choices like this one she could carry before the weight changed who she was entirely. There was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. That this wasn't the first mission where hesitation and certainty had collided inside her. That she had once believed stepping away from this work meant stepping away from the part of herself that could make this kind of decision. That leaving the rifle behind had not erased the memory of what it felt like to be the last line between chaos and survival. But today had reminded her of a truth she wished didn't exist. Sometimes someone still had to carry the burden. And today that someone had been her. The helicopter engines whined to life. Wind kicked dust into the air, swirling earth around boots and bandages and shattered branches. Elena turned away from the noise, from the drifting sand, from eyes that lingered on her with gratitude wrapped in unease. Morrison stepped closer, dropping his voice. "Why didn't you say anything before?" he asked. He didn't sound angry. He sounded human. Confused. Uncertain where his authority ended and his respect began. She considered the question not quickly, not defensively, but honestly. Then she gave the only answer she could live with. "Because knowing who I used to be," she said softly, "doesn't change what I needed to be today." He studied her for a moment, seeing not arrogance, not defiance, but something quieter. A woman who didn't want admiration, didn't want spotlight, didn't want a story built around her. Just someone who wanted fewer names read at ceremonies. He nodded once. Not approval. Understanding. It was enough. As the helicopter lifted off, The sound rumbled through her chest, vibrating against the hollow places she'd kept sealed for years. She watched it rise, watched the men inside vanish into the sky, and for a fleeting second a strange emotion surfaced, not relief, not sorrow. Something closer to humility. Not the kind that made her feel small, but the kind that reminded her how close every decision lived to the edge of uncertainty. Because even when she was right, it still cost something. She walked away from the clearing as the wind settled, and the forest slowly remembered how to breathe again. The sun filtered through the branches in thin, fractured bands, cutting light across her face as she moved back toward the ridge where the day had turned. She wasn't returning to examine the fight. She was returning to examine herself. At the crest she paused, letting the quiet wrap around her. The slope below looked ordinary again, just trees and stone and soil, no evidence of the fear that had lived there only an hour earlier. But she knew better. Places remember. So do people. She closed her eyes and listened, not for danger, not for movement, but for something deeper. For the part of her that had always known this path wasn't simple. For the part of her that refused to let necessity harden into indifference. For the part of her that still believed restraint mattered just as much as precision. The past hadn't vanished. It never would. But its shadow no longer felt like a chain. It felt like a compass, guiding her, warning her, reminding her. She wasn't the same woman who had walked away years ago in fear of becoming defined by a single moment. She was someone who now understood that what defined a person wasn't whether they made mistakes, but whether they learned how to carry them without letting them consume who they were. Below her, the forest swayed gently. Quiet, patient, alive. And for the first time since the gunfire stopped, Elena Reeves allowed herself a breath that didn't tremble. Not because the weight was gone, but because she had finally accepted that some burdens aren't meant to disappear. They're meant to be carried. Carefully, deliberately, with dignity. Why did the room fall silent the moment she stepped inside, and why did it feel heavier than the battlefield? The fluorescent lights above the briefing table hummed softly, a dull, sterile contrast to the raw wind and dust she'd left behind hours earlier. Elena stood just inside the doorway, the faint scent of antiseptic mixing with dried earth on her sleeves, and for a moment she wondered which world felt more unreal, the one where she'd pulled a trigger, or the one where people now waited to ask her why. No one spoke right away. Papers lay scattered across the table, maps, range diagrams, grainy photos of terrain that already lived more vividly in her mind than any ink on a page could capture. Morrison stood near the far wall, arms crossed, jaw tight, not in anger, but in the uneasy posture of someone still trying to make sense of what had happened. A colonel cleared his throat. "Sit down, Reeves." The words weren't harsh, they weren't soft either. They simply carried weight. She took the empty chair nearest the corner, not at the head, not at the center, just far enough from everything to observe before engaging. That habit had never really left her. A projector hummed to life. The ridge appeared on the wall in pale blues and muted greens, a cold mirror of the place where real fear and real choices had lived only hours earlier. "Walk us through it," the colonel said. Not accusatory, not admiring, measured. She looked at the image, at the thin tree line, the uneven slope, the fractured rock. Her voice, when it came, was calm and steady, as if she were narrating someone else's actions instead of reliving her own. "They weren't firing randomly," she began. "They were controlling movement, bracketing the wounded, forcing hesitation." A few heads lifted. She traced the ridgeline with her fingertip, stopping at a small crease in the terrain barely visible on screen. "They used elevation not to dominate," she continued softly, but to disappear. The room listened, not out of obligation, out of curiosity. She described the pattern of intervals between shots, the subtle shift in angles, how the terrain disguised distance differently depending on where you stood. Her words didn't dramatize anything. They didn't inflate the moment or diminish it. They simply honored its complexity. Someone interrupted. How did you locate them without counterfire triangulation? Elena paused. She could have spoken about instinct, experience, the kind of intuition that forms only when knowledge and memory collide in a way science struggles to measure. Instead, she said, I watched the trees. A few eyebrows rose. She let the silence breathe before continuing. Wind patterns, bark splinter direction, pressure breaks in foliage. They were disciplined, but terrain still reacts. It wasn't bragging. It was observation. And yet, beneath the technical language, something deeper lived in her voice, a quiet reverence for how close everything had come to tipping in a different direction. Morrison shifted slightly, then spoke for the first time since the meeting began. She didn't just locate them, he said quietly. She acted before command authorized. The words didn't sting. They settled. Because they were true. The colonel looked at Elena again, not harshly, but with the kind of steady gaze that asks a question without needing to form it aloud. Why? The room waited. Clocks ticked. HVAC vents hummed softly overhead. Elena didn't rush the answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because some truths deserved more space than others. They were targeting the wounded, she said gently. And every second we delayed narrowed the window between survivable and not. Her gaze dropped for a moment to her own hands, resting on the table. I had the position, I had confirmation, and I had the responsibility of knowing that if I stayed silent, someone else would pay for that silence. No speech. No justification. Just honest weight. No one argued. No one praised. They just listened, and in their silence lived something she hadn't expected. Respect that didn't feel like approval, and didn't feel like judgment either. It felt like recognition. The colonel exhaled slowly, then pressed a button that advanced the slide. A photograph appeared, the damaged rifle stock she had used that day. The fracture line was clear. Tension rippled across the table. You engaged with this, someone murmured. Yes, she said. A pause. Why risk it? She thought about saying what she knew they wanted to hear. Because it still held alignment. Because I trusted my form. Because the tolerances remained stable enough. Instead, she answered differently. Because choosing a safer weapon meant losing time, she said softly. And the time I would have taken, someone else didn't have. The room wasn't quiet out of shock. It was quiet because everyone there understood that truth far more intimately than they wished they did. A younger officer across the table looked at her with a mixture of admiration and unease. The look of someone who suddenly understood that leadership didn't always come with clarity, but still demanded decisions. There was something you didn't mention in your after-action, the colonel said gently. Your background. The word hovered. Background. As if the years of training, restraint, scars, mistakes, discipline, lessons, regrets, could be summarized by a single line in a personnel file. She didn't flinch. Yes, sir. You walked away from that role, he continued. Why? The image on the wall blurred. Not from the projector. From memory. She could almost smell the dust of a different hillside, hear a call she hadn't wanted to hear answered, feel a weight she'd carried long after others told her to put it down. I made a decision, she said quietly, one I'll always question, even if I know why I made it. No dramatics. No details. No spectacle, just truth. Honest, measured, human. And I thought stepping away, she continued after a moment, meant stepping away from that part of myself. The colonel studied her, not as a weapon, not as an asset, but as a person standing at the narrow intersection between burden and purpose. Did today change that? He asked. She didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't simple. Because nothing about today had been simple. It didn't change the past, she said finally, but it changed what I'm willing to do with it. That was the closest she could come to admitting what had begun to take shape inside her. Not absolution, not redemption, but direction. Something steadier than pride. Something quieter than certainty. Morrison spoke again, his voice different this time, not the voice of a commander addressing a subordinate, but of a man acknowledging responsibility. She didn't act recklessly, he said. She acted when I couldn't. Elena looked up, surprised by the honesty of it. He wasn't diminishing himself. He wasn't elevating her. He was admitting something very few leaders ever did. That sometimes the hardest truth in a mission wasn't failure. It was hesitation. The colonel nodded slowly, thoughtful, reflective. Your judgment saved lives, he said. Not a commendation. Not a verdict. Just a statement of fact. But judgment, he continued carefully, is something we must learn to teach, not just rely on. His eyes softened. Would you be willing, he asked, to help us do that? The question didn't feel like opportunity. It felt like responsibility, leaning gently forward. Teaching, guiding, passing on lessons that had never been written into manuals because they were too heavy to fit between printed lines. There was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. That the idea of stepping back toward that world, not as a shooter, but as a voice, frightened her more than any ridge line ever had. Because teaching others how to live with consequence meant living with her own every day. She inhaled slowly, exhaled softly. Yes, she said. Not bold, not confident, just honest. Because saying yes didn't erase the past. It simply refused to waste it. The meeting ended without applause, without theatrics, without neatly packaged closure. Papers gathered, chairs shifted, doors opened. Life moved forward the way it always does. But as Elena stood alone for a moment in the dim, empty briefing room, staring at the faint ghost of the ridge still lingering on the wall where the projector had shut off, a quiet realization settled into place. Her greatest struggle was no longer whether she belonged in that world. It was whether she could help others walk through it without losing themselves. And for the first time, that didn't feel like punishment. It felt like purpose. Not loud, not triumphant, just steady and deeply human. Why did the classroom feel more dangerous to her than any ridgeline she'd ever taken position on? Rows of chairs faced a blank projection screen, the faint echo of footsteps from the hallway fading into stillness. Elena stood near the back wall, arms folded loosely, watching the young operators settle into their seats, some leaning back with quiet confidence, others sitting forward, alert, eager, uncertain. They didn't know her yet. Not really. To them she was a name they'd heard spoken in careful tones, a story told in fragments, a presence associated with words like judgment, precision, restraint. She could feel their curiosity and their doubt. A few whispered to each other, the kind of murmurs that live somewhere between respect and skepticism. That used to bother her. Today it grounded her. Because skepticism meant they still questioned the world around them. And questioning, she had learned, was often the first defense against arrogance. The training director introduced her in a single sentence that felt lighter than the weight behind it. She'll be teaching decision discipline and situational judgment. Decision discipline. She almost smiled. It sounded clean, orderly, predictable. But there was nothing predictable about the kinds of decisions she was here to talk about. She stepped forward. The room quieted, not abruptly, just gradually, like a tide pulling back. No slides, no diagrams, just silence, and the expectation that it would be filled. She let it breathe for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then gently, "Tell me," she said, "what do you think judgment looks like when everything around you is loud?" A few glanced at one another. One trainee raised his hand, careful, composed. "Clarity," he said, "confidence acting fast." She nodded. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. "What about when everything is quiet?" she asked softly. No one answered. Not right away, because they already sensed that quiet wasn't the absence of danger. Sometimes it was the shape of it. She began walking slowly between the rows, not packing, not commanding attention, just existing within the same space as them. "In training," she said, "we talk about targets, distances, timing, angles, because those are things we can measure." She stopped beside an empty chair. "But the hardest part of judgment," she continued, "is what we can't measure." Eyes followed her now, not out of obligation, out of recognition that her words came from experience, not theory. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "you'll have everything you need except certainty." A quiet tension filled the air. Not fear. Something more complicated. Something honest. She could see it in their faces. The realization that the path they'd chosen wasn't simply about skill or bravery. It was about carrying doubt and acting anyway. But acting carefully, deliberately, responsibly. One of the women near the front lifted her hand. "What if we make the wrong choice?" she asked. Her voice wasn't shaky. It was brave in a different way, brave enough to admit the question out loud. Alina didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't comforting. And it shouldn't be. "You will," she said softly. The room went still. No one shifted. No one looked away. "You will make choices," she continued, "that you'll carry long after the mission ends, even when you did everything right, even when the outcome was necessary." Her gaze lowered slightly, not to hide emotion, but to respect it. "And sometimes," she added, "you'll replay them because caring about the cost doesn't make you weak." She paused. "It makes you safe. Not tactically safe. Morally safe. Humanly safe." The tension in the room eased, not because the fear vanished, but because they understood that their fear mattered, that it had a place in the conversation. They weren't being shaped into machines. They were being asked to remain people. A training officer in the corner finally spoke. "What changed for you?" he asked. His voice wasn't challenging. It was sincere. She thought of the ridge, the wounded, the silence between heartbeats, the past she had tried to bury, and the truth that kept returning to her. "For a long time," she said, "I believed that stepping away from this work meant I was protecting myself from making a mistake again." The room listened, not to the story, but to the weight beneath it. "But distance doesn't erase responsibility," she continued gently. "It just shifts where you stand when someone else has to make the choice." The realization landed softly, then firmly. She looked at the faces around her, some young, some already carrying quiet scars behind their eyes. "You will never be able to make every decision without doubt," she said, "but you can decide who you are when that doubt arrives." Silence again. But now it felt different. Not heavy. Reflective. A question she had carried silently for years now lived in the room with them, not as fear, but as guidance. A trainee at the back leaned forward, voice low but steady. "How do you live with it?" he asked. "Not the job. Not the missions. The weight." She took a breath. Let it release slowly. "You don't try to make it disappear," she said. "You let it remind you why restraint matters, why patience matters, why life, anyone's life, should never become just a calculation." Her voice softened. "You carry it carefully. No one wrote notes. No one looked away. They didn't need diagrams. They needed permission to remain human." She ended the session without applause, without closure, without pretending that one conversation could prepare them for everything ahead. Instead, she left them with a quiet sentence, one that had taken years to understand. "Strength isn't measured by how much you can shut out," she said. "It's measured by how much you can feel. And still choose carefully." The room didn't move for a moment. Then slowly chairs shifted, bags lifted, quiet conversations resumed. But something lingered in the air, not fear, not awe. Something closer to respect. Not for her. For the weight of what they were being trusted with. When the last of them left, Elena stood alone near the window, watching evening light spill across the courtyard outside. Wind moved through the flag above the rooftop, not dramatic, not symbolic. Just real. Simple. Alive. And for the first time, the guilt she had carried for years didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a lesson, finally given purpose. Not to erase what came before, but to make sure someone else might walk through similar moments. With just a little more care, a little more patience, a little more dignity. She exhaled softly, not in relief, in acceptance, because she finally understood. Her role wasn't to silence the past. It was to guide others through the weight of their own, so they wouldn't have to carry it alone. Why did the hallway feel longer tonight than it ever had before, and why did every step echo like a memory she hadn't fully faced yet? Elena walked slowly past the framed mission photos lining the wall, each one frozen in time, each one holding expressions that spoke about things no caption ever could. Pride, fatigue, loss, survival, the quiet cost of doing what had to be done. Outside, the evening sky bled into deep blue, the horizon fading gently into darkness. The world was still, calm, and yet inside something was shifting again. Not breaking, not unraveling, just moving. She paused near the end of the corridor, where a single light cast a soft reflection across the polished floor. For a moment she stood with her hand resting lightly against the wall, as if grounding herself between two worlds, the one she had lived through, and the one she was still learning to live in. A quiet voice spoke behind her. "Ma'am." She turned. The young woman from the front row of the classroom stood there, shoulders steady, eyes uncertain but not afraid. She hesitated, not out of doubt in herself, but out of respect for the weight she sensed she was approaching. "Can I ask you something?" Elena nodded gently. The hallway softened into silence around them. The trainee drew a slow breath. "How do you know," she said carefully, "when you've done enough?" The question wasn't about missions. It wasn't about performance. It was about humanity. About the fragile line between courage and exhaustion, between service and self-disappearance. Elena didn't answer right away, because the truth wasn't something that belonged wrapped in quick reassurance. She looked past the young woman for a moment, not distant, not detached, just thoughtful. Then she spoke softly. "You don't," she said. The words didn't fall heavy. They landed gently, honestly. "You never truly know," she continued. "You just learn to live inside the space between doing what you can and wishing you could have done more." The trainee swallowed, not in fear but in understanding. a kind of acceptance. But Elena added, you also learned that enough isn't measured in outcomes. A quiet breath. It's measured in intention. Wind slid faintly against the windows, almost imperceptible. You hold yourself accountable, she said. You question your choices. You stay willing to feel the cost of them. And if you can still carry compassion, if you can still see people instead of roles. Her voice softened further. Then you haven't lost yourself. The young woman nodded slowly, as if storing the words somewhere she knew she might need one day. Thank you, she whispered. Not grateful for certainty. Grateful for truth. She stepped away, leaving the hallway empty again. But Alina didn't move. Because something about that question lingered longer than the echo of footsteps. How do you know when you've done enough? Years ago, she would have believed there was a single moment where the answer revealed itself. A mission completed, a life saved, a balance restored. Now she understood something different. Enough wasn't a destination. It was a responsibility you carried forward. Quietly, carefully, without pretending it weighed nothing. She walked outside into the cool night air. The base lights glowed softly against the pavement, distant engines humming like a memory that refused to fade. Above her, the stars stretched across the sky, not dramatic, not symbolic, just steady. Real. She sat on a low concrete barrier near the edge of the lot, elbows resting against her knees, hands loosely clasped. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to sit without purpose, without obligation, without needing to prepare for the next decision waiting to be made. The ridge came back to her, the wind, the tremor in her chest, the sound that never arrived after the last shot, not as guilt, not as relief, as truth. A part of her still wished that day had never demanded someone like her, that lives could be saved without sacrifice, that choices could exist without consequences. But another part of her, the part that had learned to see dignity not in heroics, but in restraint, knew something else. Avoiding the burden had never protected anyone. Carrying it had. Footsteps approached again, slower this time, deliberate. Morrison stopped beside her, hands tucked loosely into his pockets, gaze fixed somewhere toward the empty airfield. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence shared only by people who had walked through something together without ever fully speaking about it. Finally, he exhaled. They're going to restructure the judgment course, he said quietly. Build it around your framework. She didn't respond. Not out of indifference. Out of humility. And they're assigning you as permanent lead, he added. The words settled gently. He glanced at her. You don't have to accept, he said. No one would question it if you didn't. She thought about that. About what turning away would mean, and what accepting would require. Once she might have said no. Not because she lacked strength, but because she feared becoming defined by the part of her life that had hurt the most. Now, she understood that turning away didn't erase anything. It only left others to face the same weight without a hand to steady them. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. I won't teach them to be fearless, she said. Morrison nodded. I know. I'll teach them to feel everything, she continued softly, and still choose carefully. He looked at her, not as a commander looking at a subordinate, not as a witness to an extraordinary act, but as a man who finally understood what leadership could look like when it didn't demand hardness to exist. That's exactly why you're the one who should do it, he said. The air around them felt lighter, but not weightless, just honest. He walked away after a while, leaving her alone beneath the quiet stretch of sky. She tilted her head back. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes. Not to escape, to acknowledge every choice, every silence, every doubt that had shaped her. She thought of the young operators who would sit in those chairs one day, carrying their own unspoken fears, their own fragile hopes, their own uncertain lines between right and necessary. And she knew, with a depth that didn't shout, her role was not to turn them into symbols. Her role was to keep them human, even when the world around them forgot what that meant. She rose slowly, the cool night air brushing against her skin, and started back toward the lights of the building. Her steps were steady now, not lighter, not heavier. Just grounded, purposeful. She didn't walk like someone seeking redemption. She walked like someone who had learned that redemption isn't something you take. It's something you live. Quietly, consistently, in the way you treat others, in the way you treat yourself, in the way you face the echoes of your choices, without letting them define your worth. At the doorway, she paused for one last breath of night air. The world didn't feel conquered. It didn't feel resolved. It simply felt real. And as she stepped inside, leaving the darkness behind and moving toward whatever waited in the days ahead, one simple truth followed her, steady, unspoken, enduring. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.